always a thing or two new you can learn about the jig. Right, guys?
Tommy Sanders, it is the running back of the Bassmaster Elite Series. And really, if you were to take every single Elite Series angler, if you're going to take every single one of them and say for the rest of your life, you can only have one bait to either go fishing or fish tournaments, I guarantee you the jig would outnumber everything else. And the reason why, really, Dave Mercer, is a jig works on every single lake across the country.
It does. And before we started here, I was sitting there staring at those jigs, and I'm thinking, was there a time that I've gone fishing that I haven't had a jig rigged up? And there really isn't, because at any time you can throw that bait, whether the fish are chomping or a lot of times when it gets tough. You pick up a jig and you have confidence. You know that you can catch a fish.
And not only that, the great thing about a jig is you're always one bite, which a jig is one of the best bites on earth. You're one bite from catching a true giant. But there's different kinds of jigs, and what we're going to get into today is football jig fishing. Is so many years that we've covered the Elite Series. You look at the Tommy Biffles, you look at the Denny Browers, shallow water target fishermen. But over the last few years, this little guy right here, the football jig, has been a major player. And one of the misconceptions is you can't cover water with it. Well, that is so far from the truth with this. The reason why, the standard sizes for football jigs, ½ ounce, 3/4, 1 ounce, and these guys are launching these and using that bait, using the head of that bait as their eyes under the water. And really, if you look at the one angler, Mike McClellan, he has made a career in the last 6 years throwing a jig. Whether you look at his victory on Grand Lake or you transition from Grand Lake over to when he won on Clark's Hill, a lot of the lakes that these guys really excel on is lakes that they're completely void of cover except for little isolated pieces, whether it's rock or laydowns. That jig seems to be a great weapon for that.
Something interesting you said is this bait is their eyes under the water. And it truly is, because generally, most times you're fishing, a football jig like this, you're basically dragging that bait back to the boat. And what that does is it allows you to cover a lot of water, number one. Number two, it allows you to feel what's down there. It really is the best bait for dragging that bait along, and it's usually subtle, tiny little things. I mean, always people think that there's some huge code that guys like Mike McClellan uncover, but usually it's a subtle, tiny little difference, just a difference on the bottom, and he feels that through dragging that jig.
I'm looking at that bait you're holding right there. If you look at every single one of these jigs on the table, every single one of them, they have a flat eye. That's what makes a football jig what it is that eye right there, instead of being a straight eye. A straight eye, phenomenal in grass, shallow water, when you got a slick through cover. The reason it's got a flat eye, you want this to roll over rock. You want it to roll over, whether it's a laydown. You're not going to take a football jig and just throw it in the middle of a grass bed. This is for that outer structure, outside from the heavy grass. And the other thing about a football jig, it looks like everything in the lake that a bass wants to kill. Whether it's a bluegill, whether it's a crawdad, it looks like everything a bass wants to eat. And one of the things about jig fishing, and it's the best thing in bass fishing, is whenever you watch those shallow water bangers, the Denny Browers and stuff like that, you watch them up shallow and they do that, what I always call the Bassmaster Elite Series hook set. You really don't do that with a jig. It's more of a reel set, okay? And what I mean by that is when you launch this out, you've got so much line down there. When you feel that bite, whether it's a tunk or you feel one swim off, the thing with a football jig, all you want to do is tighten up on him and bring it back. And what that does, it enables that head to not bust his mouth open, and it lets that hook penetrate. And that's one of the biggest keys on a football jig, different from a shallow water jig, is that hook. A lot of times when you're up shallow, you want a real heavy gauge hook because you're wrestling right next to the boat. When you're football jig fishing, you want a little bit lighter wire, thin diameter, so you can penetrate when you set the hook.
One thing you hear all across the country, I mean, we heard it right before we started here. One of the guys here said, I wish I was a better jig fisherman. And you hear that all the time for such an effective bait. It's shocking that so many people say that. But I think the reason is because, the shallow water jigs and now the football jigs, people kind of equate it to the first bait they fished, maybe a worm, something like that. And a lot of times when you're fishing a worm, you feel that, and you can kind of feel that fish is on there, and don't eat. I'm going to set the hook now. With a jig, it's not that. I mean, I'll tell people a lot of times, the thing to remember is when you feel that first thump, that's the fish going and eating it. The second thump is the fish dropping it out of their mouth. So as soon as you feel it, whether it's a football jig and you're just reeling up to that fish, or you're doing the Denny Brauer power blast, you need to set the hook on the fish.
Right, and in one of the tournaments that accounted for almost every single bass that hit our scales was when Denny Brauer won a year ago on the Arkansas River, fishing a very, very small, isolated pile of shells. There were so many bass on there, and I was watching him fish it, one of the best jig fishermen on earth. You talk about people wanting to get better with this, and he would say this, Denny Brauer, he's constantly said this, envision what that bait is doing beneath the surface. Just don't throw it out and move your rod around. Envision what that bait is doing, what it looks like, and if something is different, if something feels different, you better start pulling and pulling immediately.
The jig probably helped him find that spot and helped him fish it efficiently. The other thing you want to do is visualize always that there's a fish near your bait, because you're right, most anglers daydreaming, just looking around, and they feel that, and then they turn around to see, oh, do I have one? And he's spitting it out. But always visualize that there's a fish after your bait. If you're working that bait and you think a fish after it, it's like sight fishing. When you're sight fishing and you're looking at a fish and you see it turn, you're on your game. You're reacting right away. You can't see what's going on, but if you visualize that there's a fish behind your bait the whole time, you're going to work it a lot more effectively.
A little bit different on the football jigs compared to the shallow water jigs. You're not using a broomstick, you're not using 25-pound line, you're using usually lighter line, 15-pound, 17-pound line, but you're using long rods. And the reason why is you're launching this thing. You're throwing it as far as you can throw it, and a lot of times those bites come on the end of the cast to where you make that reel hook set and you come back on him. What that long rod does is it takes that line and digs it into that fish's face, and you're able to pick up a lot of that slack. It's a total different system compared to shallow water, flip-in, pitching like that. You really want to downscale to a medium heavy rod, a little bit lighter line for this.
The thing to keep in mind about a football jig, totally different than, traditional jig fishing or flipping, where when you're flipping, I mean, a lot of times people use as light a jig as they can get away with, just so that bait falls really slowly in front of the fish. They'll put a bulkier skirt so it falls a little bit slower. Here, you need to be on the bottom. You need a heavy weight so that thing goes boom. It's not eating, the fish is not going to eat that bait on the way down, it's eating it on the bottom. So you need to get that bait to the bottom, which also, if you ask me, for newer anglers or people who are just getting into jig fishing, that's an advantage because you know you're on bottom, you're feeling it.
Exactly, and if you really look at the last 6 years, a lot of the guys that we looked at today, they have made their living fishing a jig.